The following programme contains descriptions of real-life violence that some viewers may find distressing.
In August 1994, in the town of Castledurg, Northern Ireland, 15-year-old Arlene Arkinson went out to a disco and never came home.
I just wished I had said, no, I'll don't go, please don't go. But I don't know.
The last person to see Arlene was 50-year-old Robert Howard. He was in a relationship with Arlene's friend's mother and a convicted sex offender.
This was part of his pattern of going to a place, kind of infiltrating himself with people, often people that had young daughters.
He would attract children to his flat, and one neighbour called him the Pied Piper.
Arlene's disappearance went unsolved. 7 years later, another teenager went missing in southeast London.
Still in my mind, the last word she said to me, "Mum, I love you and I'll never leave you."
When Hannah Williams's body was found a year later, all roads led to Robert Howard.
We put his name into the police national computer and was staggered to find what we would describe as a career sexual offender.
Though it took decades to bring him to justice, Robert Howard was finally proven to be one of Britain's most evil killers. Robert Howard was a serial sex offender who preyed on vulnerable women and girls for over 35 years.
Howard was a prolific, predatory sex offender and had been a sex offender from a very, very young age.
He was someone who, everywhere he went, would have an interest in young girls. And then eventually that would become difficult for him, so he would move on and he would just do it somewhere else.
Though there was plenty of suspicion along the way, it would take years for the true horror of Howard's crimes to be uncovered.
There's no doubt now that Howard murdered Arlene. Why did the RUC let him get away with it? He was in bail for assaulting another child. A public inquiry should examine all of us.
This killer's story begins on the 20th of April 1944. Robert Howard was born into a large family in the tiny rural community of Wolf Hill in the Republic of Ireland. Howard would come to be known as Wolfman and later gave himself a middle name, Lazarian.
So his name was Robert Lazarian Howard, and Lazarian is the name of a mythical child killer.
From early childhood, Howard rarely attended school and soon turned his attention to making money any way he could.
His first acknowledged burglary came when he was 13, and he was sent away. Remember, we're talking about Ireland in the 1950s, and he was put into Catholic institutions. And in recent years, we've come to know that those were sometimes difficult and dangerous places to be. Robert Howard came out of the institution at the age of 16, but wasn't welcomed back into the bosom of his family.
Howard was forced to live as a vagrant, staying in local barns, sheds and other derelict buildings in the countryside around Wolf Hill.
That is an incredibly young and vulnerable age to suddenly find yourself having to look after yourself completely.
He had a nomadic, difficult background, there's no question of that. And I think he was someone who was continually in difficulties with the law.
At one point, he's actually effectively forced to leave Ireland and go to the UK.
By the age of 21, Howard was living in London, where in 1965 he committed his first known sexual offence.
He broke into a house and tried to rape a 6-year-old girl. He got away at that point, but returned a week later and was caught. He got 9 days Borstal for that.
This slap on the wrist did nothing to deter Howard. He was deported back to the Republic of Ireland, but quickly returned.
He returns to the UK, and in 1969, at the age of 24, he breaks into the home of a young married woman in Durham, in the north of England, and tries to rape her.
She clearly fought with him, ran into the street seeking help. He attacks her and grabs her around the throat in the street in front of people who were coming to her aid. Now that's a really serious escalation.
Howard was sentenced to 6 years in HMP Frankland, but served only 3. On his release, he moved to the Republic of Ireland and began reoffending.
From that point on, Howard went on a litany of sexual offending.
He was someone who was continually prosecuted for quite a number of serious offences. The point here being that he's not somebody who was below the radar.
In May 1973, Howard attacks a 58-year-old woman. He breaks into her house, rapes her, sodomizes her, leaves her tied to the bed, and drives off in her car.
He is arrested for that offence, and he's arrested in an airport, so he's probably trying to leave the country again to escape.
This time he's actually exposed to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist says he's softly spoken, he's courteous. You could never imagine that he would do anything violent.
But the psychiatrist knew full well that Howard had an interest in teenage girls and described Howard as an explosive psychopath.
Howard was sentenced to 10 years in jail. Upon his release 8 years later, the 38-year-old showed himself once again to be a wolf in sheep's clothing.
He had a propensity to befriend people and to befriend vulnerable people, to find his way into their home.
Not long after his release, Howard marries a young woman, and they have a relationship for 3 years.
That marriage was never going to be anything but abusive. Probably that was simply to trap her as this ever-present victim.
After the marriage broke down, Howard settled in Castlederg, a small town in County Tyrone, near the Irish border.
He did have a period of time where he was living in a caravan. There's an allegation of a case whereby he kept a lady captive.
She was a vulnerable woman he'd befriended in Dublin and invited to stay with him. He was 47 years old, she was 22.
He keeps a prisoner there for 3 weeks, raping her repeatedly. She was actually rescued by her family, not by the police.
There was a huge reluctance in Northern Ireland for people to go to the police. You didn't think you'd be believed, thought that you might end up under suspicion yourself.
Eventually, the police were told many years after this event, but they didn't press charges. They believed she was too vulnerable to give evidence.
Howard moved to a flat in the centre of Castlederg and started a friendship with a woman who had a teenage daughter.
It's very common in cases like this where a man has an interest in younger people that he will often become a very trusted friend of the family, which gives them access to abuse young girls.
And this girlfriend seemed to suspect his true intentions.
She actually commented that she was aware he was more interested in younger girls than in women.
Howard began to befriend his girlfriend's daughter and her friends, one of whom was a 16-year-old girl.
Robert Howard had lured this young girl to his flat in Main Street, Castlederg, on the pretense of meeting a taxi driver who the young girl wanted to meet and perhaps go out with. When she got into his flat, she complained of a headache and he gave her tablets. The next thing she knew, she woke up naked in his bed with a ligature around her neck.
He effectively drugged her and kept her captive.
And he rapes her repeatedly, very much as he'd done the vulnerable young woman from Dublin.
On the third day of this nightmare, when Howard had fallen asleep, the girl jumped out of a second-floor window. She reported everything to the police.
They did arrest Howard. And what did Howard say? Yeah, all of that happened, but it was with consent.
Howard was charged but let out on bail. He was free to continue preying on teenage girls, and his next attack could leave no victim to testify. In 1994, Robert Howard was on bail accused of rape and unlawful imprisonment, and living in Castle Derg, a small Northern Irish town close to the border with the Republic of Ireland.
At this point, there was still a militarised border in parts, so you did see a lot of soldiers around. These are interesting places. They can be quite lawless, particularly in the 90s when the Troubles were still going on, but it was surprisingly easy still to just get across the border.
A short drive from where Howard lived, 15-year-old Arlene Arkinson was staying with her brother, near her older sister, Kathleen.
Arlene was a beautiful child. Arlene was bubbly. Everything she wanted, she got it. She just was the baby of the house, and she was spoiled. Mommy passed, and that had a wild toll on Arlene, so Arlene was only 11.
Her mother had died a few years before, and she had been living with her father for a little while, but he was a bit unstable, so hadn't been able to take care of her, and she'd kind of moved around living with her different siblings and their families. So she was a somewhat vulnerable girl, but very loved and cared for.
On Saturday, the 13th of August 1994, Arlene was helping out her sister.
I asked her to babysit. It was a lovely August, summertime, lovely day.
When Kathleen got home around 10:30 p.m, she found out one of Arlene's friends had invited her out.
She said, but I don't want to go out anyway. Don't bother us.
But then Kathleen heard a knock at the door. It was Arlene's friend.
She says, we're going to the door. I want Arlene to go along with us. I says, Arlene's got no money. And she says, Arlene, come on here, I have a tenner.
Kathleen was led to believe Arlene's friend's mother was going to be looking after them. But it was the mother's boyfriend who chaperoned them that night.
Arlene goes out with her friend to a local disco. They're being driven there by Robert Howard.
When Arlene didn't arrive back home at Kathleen's house, I think Kathleen at that time reasonably assumed that Arlene had been left off at her brother's house. But of course, when they realised the next day that Arlene wasn't with either of them, when the alarm bells started to ring.
Kathleen's first port of call was to visit the mother of Arlene's friend, who she believed was taking care of the girls the night before.
Kathleen, of her own volition, went to the family to try to find out exactly what had happened. They all denied any knowledge of anything, of any harm coming to Arlene. And there was even allegations that Arlene wasn't even present, that she didn't go to Bundoran.
The following day, Mary, Kathleen and Arlene's sister knocked at the door of Arlene's friend and her mother. Robert Howard answered.
Mary says, where's our Arlene? And he says, I effing don't know. And he closed the door on her face. Mary came down here crying, and I said, what's wrong? She said, don't you forget the last time you seen Arlene? She said, I think it's the last.
And of course, during the time, they went to the authorities, including the social services and to the police, but the family just lied to Kathleen's face, and so did Howard.
The last time Arlene was seen was in Howard's car. When questioned, Howard, who at the time was on bail for the rape and imprisonment of another teenager, denied all knowledge of her whereabouts.
At one stage, he was saying that he had left her off at a local pub, but that doesn't make any sense, leaving a young girl in Castlederg at that time. The thing to do for a man of that age with a child in the car is to make sure that she was left at the door of an appropriate adult, and he didn't do that because what he said, of course, was a complete pack of lies. What is difficult to come to terms with is that in view of his background and the charges that he was actually out on bail upon, he had to be suspect number one.
46 days after Arlene's disappearance, Robert Howard was arrested.
We know that when the police did arrest Howard, that the boot lining from his vehicle was missing, and that the clothing that he'd worn on the night he went to Bundoran had disappeared.
So anything that might have indicated some harm had come to Arlene was now gone.
Howard's alibi that he returned home to his girlfriend's house at around 2:30 a.m. was corroborated by his girlfriend and her daughter.
They sort of went along with what Howard was telling them to say, and it got really, really complicated to work out what the truth was.
So I think men like Robert Howard, they know how to target vulnerable girls as well.
Robert Howard was released without charge. The case went cold. Arlene did not return to Castlederg. In 1995, Howard agreed a plea bargain in the case of the 16-year-old girl he'd been accused of holding captive 2 years earlier. In return for pleading guilty to unlawful carnal knowledge, the rape and unlawful imprisonment charges were dropped.
Now, unlawful carnal knowledge at that point was having sex with consent of a girl under the age of 17, while the victim was 16. She attended court ready to give evidence, but her evidence was never given because the prosecuting authorities made that deal, and Howard was given a suspended sentence.
Despite his victim's bravery, Robert Howard escaped proper punishment for a heinous sexual crime.
Local feeling turned against Howard, and he received a visit from certain individuals who threatened his life and gave him a period of time to leave the province, and Howard did.
In 1995, Howard fled to Glasgow.
Howard moving away, and with the police not actively pursuing him, they pursue another line of inquiry.
Their suspicions seemed to fall on Arlene's family, and they actually went round to her sister's house who she was living with.
The police claimed that they had information from a reliable source that Arlene had been murdered in her sister's home, and that Arlene was pushed down the stairs, and then she was buried at the home.
In April 1996, police and soldiers turned up to Kathleen's home, accompanied by the press.
They brought in diggers even to dig up the garden. She said they battered the door down as well.
The search continued for a number of days.
There was forensics everywhere. It was just like something like a horror movie. They actually took out my coal out of my fire, to analyse my coal. Like, what was that all about? Took the clothes of the clothesline.
And of course that resulted in nothing being found at all. But that event in 1996 completely soured the relationship between the Parkinson family and the police investigation. And the only person who benefited from that, of course, was Howard.
Undeterred, Kathleen found out through a friend who lived in Scotland exactly where Howard had moved to.
So I phoned one of the papers, and I said, Howard's from Scotland. I think it was Drumchapel. Leave that with me, he says.
He's outed by the Sunday Mail, called the face of evil, and pointing to his crimes in the past. Howard is literally hounded out of Glasgow. He travels south to the outskirts of London.
Howard moved to London in 1998. In 2001, Hannah Williams was a 14-year-old girl living in Deptford, southeast London.
Hannah was my daughter, my youngest daughter. My relationship with Hannah was just fantastic. She was very happy. She enjoyed being at home, loved going out to the high street, loved going to the adventure playground. She was a bit like a tom girl. She loved climbing things and jumping and that. Very energetic. I brought all three of them up myself, and I've done everything for them. It's hard bringing up three children by yourself, but yeah, I done it, and I loved it.
But Bernadette's world was about to be torn apart.
On April the 21st, 2001, Hannah goes shopping in Deptford Market.
It was about 11 o'clock. So she got up and she said, "Mum, I'm going to the market." So I said, "Well, if you hang on, I'll come with you." She said, "Mum, I'm only going round the corner just to look at the stalls and whatever."
It was a decision that would change both of their lives forever. An innocent shopping trip that would take a disastrous turn for the 14-year-old. As darkness approached in Deptford, southeast London, Hannah Williams still hadn't returned.
She didn't come home. Her mum is absolutely frantic.
I just walked and cried and walked to try and see if I could find her or see her anywhere in Deptford. I just didn't understand why she didn't answer her phone, because she always answered her phone to me.
But when she goes to the police do not suspect that anything has happened to Hannah. They're convinced that she's run away or she's gone off with friends. And of course, this was a catastrophic decision by the police.
The Metropolitan Police told me to wait for 24 hours before they could do anything. And I didn't hear nothing. I didn't hear nothing from them.
Peter Harrison was a reporter working at a local newspaper.
I was sitting in the offices of the Mercury in Deptford High Street. The doorbell went, and there's this woman standing in front of me, Bernadette, and she said to me, "Can you help me? My daughter's been missing for the last 2 weeks, and no one seems to care."
I didn't think she was dead, but something was really bad that's happened to her and she can't get home.
I remember contacting the missing people's section of Lewisham Police. The officer in question was absolutely convinced that this was a down-and-out family, runaway daughter, troublesome child.
Getting police attention, especially in a missing person case, comes back to this thing, are you the ideal victim? The less ideal you are, the less attention and sympathy you're going to get.
The Metropolitan Police have since improved missing persons investigations. How we investigate missing people has evolved in the 23 years since Hannah went missing. We take the investigation of missing people incredibly seriously and have teams in every local policing area dedicated to this work. In 2001, a number of high-profile missing children's cases meant that Hannah's story also struggled to capture the attention of the media.
It seemed at the time there was quite a few missing children. Hannah was one of many, but you had Danielle Jones, Millie Dowler.
I feel like because they were living in more suitable places and me, I was in Deptford and a single mum, so I felt like they got more coverage.
But Bernadette made sure that her daughter had a good, warm, clean home. So it seemed preposterous that Hannah was written off just because of her background.
I just didn't hear anything for a whole year, not knowing, or hoping that she'd walk through the door and say, "Hi, Mum, I'm home."
Not once was Bernadette told, look, there's a very good chance that your daughter's not going to be found alive. And so she was constantly filled with this hope.
Still in my mind, the last word she said to me, "Mum, I love you, and I'll never leave you."
In March 2002, nearly 11 months after Hannah's disappearance, Bernadette's worst fears came true.
At the time that Hannah Williams went missing, I was a senior investigating officer in major crime at Kent Police. On Friday, the 15th of March 2002, a digger driver was carrying out excavation work in a very woody area in preparation for the international rail link at Ebbsfleet Rail Terminal. He saw a blue tarpaulin wrapped in rope, and he looked inside and could see what was clearly the skeletal remains of a body.
The call came straight in to DCI Murray, and he attended the scene immediately.
It was torrential rain at the time. The excavation work meant it was thick with mud. So straight away I'm beginning to doubt whether we're going to get much forensic evidence.
The body was found with a ligature around the neck. It was clear this was no accidental death. Kent Police immediately launched a murder investigation.
We went public with details of her clothing, and immediately I had a phone call from a local reporter to say, "I know who this girl is." And he said, "It's Hannah Williams."
Kent Police took DNA, and she was my daughter. And the guy, I sent him a thank you letter for finding her out. He must have been so shocked to come across a body, and I was so happy that he found her, because if he didn't, then I still wouldn't know what's happened to her. And I went actually up to that site, and I can't even tell you how I felt, be honest. I mean, to see where your daughter's been lying for a year.
DCI Murray's first line of inquiry was to look into every detail of Hannah's final movements.
On the day she went missing, just after 11 a.m, she had a 14-second phone call from a mobile phone that was listed as belonging to a woman who lived very close to the deposition site.
Detectives went to her home. She told them she hadn't made the phone call, and it must have been her partner, Robert Howard.
When Robert Howard's name was given to us and we looked at his record and his photographs, it was just mind-blowing, because this man became our instant suspect for that murder.
Police quickly discovered the link between Howard and Hannah. Howard's girlfriend was previously in a relationship with Hannah's father. DCI Murray also found out that Howard had previously been arrested in relation to Arlene Arkinson's disappearance and about the 16-year-old he'd held captive in Castlederg.
We had Robert Howard as our number one suspect, but we had no evidence at all, apart from a possible 14-second phone call that he made, which in reality proved little, if anything. And the biggest fear that I had at that time was this man may go on a spree of killing.
Kent Police knew they didn't have enough evidence to charge Howard, but they wanted him off the streets immediately.
So we took the decision to arrest him because, in my view, to do nothing was not an option.
DCI Murray and his team searched Howard's girlfriend's home and also his allotment, which housed a derelict caravan. But they found no forensic evidence. In the meantime, Howard was taken in for questioning, but only responded, "No comment."
We certainly never had any evidence to charge Howard with Hannah's murder, and he was released from custody.
Detectives needed to find out more about Robert Howard's pattern of offending.
We've got a man, ostensibly, who's moved from Scotland down to London, and during that period of time has not come to the notice of the police. Had Howard been targeting other children? And the answer was almost undoubtedly yes.
Kent police worked with social services to identify and interview any at-risk children living close to Howard's home.
And we identified one particular young girl who would absolutely prove to be vital to our investigation.
She was just 6 years old.
Robert Howard had invited her into his flat. He indecently assaulted her, and she called him a pervert and ran out of the flat.
DCI Murray liaised with the Metropolitan Police, who agreed to arrest Howard on suspicion of indecent assault. The 6-year-old girl then told the police that Howard had also taken her on a swimming trip to the lake right next to where Hannah's body was found.
Now we've got, obviously, the background of Arlene, the young girl who'd had a ligature tied around her neck whilst Howard raped her. And now we had this young girl, similar profile, taken down to very close to where Hannah lay.
With strong circumstantial evidence showing a clear pattern of behaviour, Kent police were able to arrest Robert Howard. But did they have enough to convict him for murder? In May 2002, Kent police charged 57-year-old Robert Howard with the murder of 14-year-old Hannah Williams. While in custody, Northern Irish police arrested him for the 1994 murder of 15-year-old Arlene Arkinson. But then an anonymous tip-off accusing Arlene's sister Kathleen put both investigations into jeopardy.
We're going ahead with the trial of Robert Howard. The week before, I get a phone call from an SIO in Northern Ireland to say that they've had recent intelligence to say that Arlene's body was buried under a floor in Kathleen's house.
DCI Murray was told if the case against Howard in Northern Ireland collapsed, it could throw serious doubts on the prosecution case against him for Hannah Williams's murder. But no body was found at Kathleen's home, and she willingly came forward to help Kent police prove their case.
In our dealings with the Arkinsons, they wanted to do everything they could to help us in the prosecution of Robert Howard, and were happy to come to England and give evidence at his trial.
I done everything by myself, and to have the Arkinsons actually come over and come to the courtroom to support me, even though they're going through the grief of their sister. I mean, I thought that was so nice of them.
Kent police successfully persuaded the judge to allow Howard's previous arrests and convictions to be presented to the jury.
The court in England were able to introduce similar fact evidence of what happened in Arlene's case.
Robert Howard's trial for the murder of Hannah Williams began at Maidstone Crown Court in October 2003. The prosecution called upon evidence from Kathleen Arkinson, the 16-year-old Howard abducted in 1993, and also the 6-year-old girl from South London. Details of how Hannah's body was found were also presented to the jury.
Bernadette sat through the entire trial. She felt it was the least she could do to honour her daughter.
To hear how he put blue rope round her neck, she must have struggled to try and get away, but she wasn't obviously strong enough, and probably the more she struggled, the rope was tightening. So he strangled her. But then I think he raped her as well.
She sat through the court hearing about how the gusset of her teenage daughter's underwear had been cut out, probably to hide DNA evidence.
Howard continued to proclaim his innocence.
He stood on the stand and was telling lies after lies. He never looked up at me.
I think Robert Howard phoned Hannah Williams on the day she went missing, used some pretext to meet her, and the cause of death was the ligature around her neck. And I think at that point, he then took Hannah by vehicle over to the Blue Lake. And but for the construction of the Ebbsfleet rail terminal, she would have laid there for years, bless her.
The only time he looked up is when the jury left the courtroom to make their decision.
It took the jury just 3 hours to convict him.
In October 2003, Howard was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Kathleen approached the police van as he was being driven away.
I went over to the van. I says, Rabbi, I says, you're going to jail. You're not getting out this time. He kicked and he banged and he kicked and he banged at that door. I mean, it was like thunder. He was so angry. He knew he was going to Franklin.
I felt big relief, such as I'd done the best I could and I did get justice. That's why I'm happy.
In 2005, Robert Howard, now incarcerated for life, is brought to trial for Arlene Arkinson.
The jury weren't allowed to be told that he had murdered another teenage girl and that, in fact, he was in prison for that murder and had been brought from prison to be on trial.
And they don't convict him of Arlene's killing.
Never ever I ever blamed the jury. It wasn't their fault. They didn't know nothing. I remember my father just sitting looking at him in the box. Imagine looking at the person who murdered your child.
Despite Howard's acquittal, Kathleen continued her tireless fight to find justice for Arlene.
So the next legal possibility, now that the trial has collapsed, is an inquest.
Howard was going to be called once again to give evidence in the inquest hearing.
But then in October 2015, Howard dies.
Howard never once admitted killing Arlene. Like many murderers, he wanted to keep those secrets to himself. His last bit of control over the family and over the world.
He took Arlene's location to his grave, and it's so sad that Arlene's never been recovered.
At least I'm glad he died in prison, so he couldn't go out and hurt any other child or infant or a woman again.
After a number of legal challenges, the inquest was due to start in 2016.
And then on the eve of the inquest starting, the Secretary of State issues what is known as a PAI certificate, a Public Interest Immunity certificate. So it's effectively the government saying, on the grounds of the national security of our country, we cannot reveal this information. What on earth are they trying to keep from the inquest involving the death of a 15-year-old child?
There had been a lot of rumours that Robert Howard had been a police informer.
When asked if Howard was an informer, the police have said they will neither confirm nor deny, and that no inference should be drawn from this. The PII certificate limited what evidence could be shared, but the inquest went ahead as planned at Belfast Coroner's Court. Arlene's friend and her mother, Howard's girlfriend at the time of Arlene's disappearance, were called to give evidence. Their stories kept changing.
His partner initially was saying that he did come back in the early hours of the morning, but then that changed to him coming back later in the morning, and that he was still wearing the same clothes that he wore the evening before. So there's no doubt he had more than adequate time to murder Arlene and dispose of her body.
Detectives dropped a bombshell that they had some inside information. A confession Robert Howard had made to a cellmate.
The chief investigating officer was able to relay to the court what Howard had said about how Howard had held Arlene over a sink, how there was a lot of blood, and how she had put up a good fight. And so that was very upsetting for Kathleen to hear.
Due to huge delays in the court system, it wasn't until July 2021 that the conclusions of the inquest were shared at Omagh Courthouse, 27 years after Arlene disappeared.
The inquest into Arlene's death did conclude that Robert Howard had killed her. They ruled that they were confident her remains were still near the town where she disappeared. I think this case is just so shocking, really. We have this man with a long history of violence and convictions who's literally on bail for assaulting another teenage girl, and he's the last person to see a teenage girl alive. And yet he still completely gets away with it and is able a few years later to kill another girl.
I've always maintained that if Howard had been properly sentenced for rape, unlawful imprisonment, Arlene Arkinson and Hannah Williams would be alive today.
She never got to her prom. She never got their 16th birthday, 21st, 30, 40. All it was taken away from her. I just want her home.
Arlene's body has never been found. What exactly happened on the night of her disappearance remains a mystery.
I just wished I had said, no, I need to go, please don't go. But I didn't know. I said, I miss my sister. I just hope she didn't suffer. But I know she did suffer. But they know I'm never going to give up. I'm never going to ever. The last breath I take, I'm going to find her. Give her a decent burial.
I hate him. And just taking my 14-year-old daughter and killing her and raping her. I hate it. I always think about what she would be doing now. And I just wish Hannah was still here. But that evil person just killed her. She's always in my heart. I know she's saying, Mum, be strong. She's looking down on me right this minute. Bless her.
Robert Howard was a violent sex offender known to the authorities. He managed to brutally attack women and children for over 30 years. We may never truly know the extent of this master manipulator's crimes, but after the deaths of Arlene and Hannah were finally proven, there is no doubt that he is one of Britain's most evil killers.